Welcome, everyone, to Introduction to Governance, and thanks for joining us. This is part of our Integral Intro series where we present overviews of the areas of expertise that Integral Org provides, which includes nonprofit financials, risk management, legal compliance, and of course, nonprofit governance. My name is Liz Tang, and I use the pronoun she, her, and I'm the program coordinator for Integral Org. I'll be your host, monitoring the chat and any sort of tech support. So if you do have any needs throughout this webinar, don't be afraid to message me on the chat. So it's important to acknowledge that what we call Alberta, which is where we are located, is the traditional ancestral territory of many peoples, presently subject to Treaty 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We do respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. And we are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. And we are making this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside and work on today. We are very happy to introduce today's facilitator. This is Mike Grogan, President and CEO at Integral Org. And from board governance to strategy development and sustainability planning, Mike is recognized for his ability to inspire nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues and create impactful and lasting solutions that fit the changing needs of their organizations.
Thank you, Liz, and great to sort of see you all, at least see your names here anyway. Really excited for this session, and always just a privilege for us to engage folks, and wherever you are on your journey of nonprofits and governance and how this wonderful and wild world of nonprofits works, it's just a privilege to be here with you today. So looking forward to sharing some thoughts, always your questions, your insights, your opinions, your rebuttals perhaps, as to what works and what doesn't work in terms of governance. Great to hear. So as we move through this session today, lots of room, throw a question in the chat. Liz will monitor that. Lots of time for questions at the end. If there's anything that I'm sort of putting out there or saying, or you're wondering about and you want more information, absolutely. I mean, throw it in the chat. We'll talk about it. But no, just reach out to us. I mean, this is our job, is to talk to nonprofits about wherever you're at in your journey of your work, that our job is to come alongside and to work with you. So we're going to talk a bit about the basic principles of nonprofit governance. And when I sort of say the basics, you know, there are some sort of fundamentals for nonprofits, and it doesn't necessarily matter, I don't think, how long you've been in nonprofits or how many boards you've been on. I think every board needs to attend to their own governance and on a regular basis. And things change over time in terms of the makeup of the board, your own understanding, the way people interact with each other, the way they may interact with an executive or a management team. So it's a place that nonprofits always need to focus on. I don't think enough of us do this. I think some of us sort of let this go and say, well, I've been on a board forever, so of course I know this stuff. It rarely works out that way in reality. So Integral Org, we are a nonprofit and charities, and our work is to help other nonprofits and charities deal with what they need to deal with. So what we do quite often on our board is make sure they understand that role of governance. So we'll talk about some of that. We'll talk about the roles as an individual and as a board as a whole. They are a little bit different. Maybe some of the common issues in what boards are facing these days. I think boards have had a tough go of it, you know, through COVID and coming out of it. And so where we're seeing some of the stresses right now, some of those tensions that are built in, sort of longer lasting, some of the new ones, present a little bit stuff on a theory called governance as leadership, which sort of takes it beyond the basics of governance to, and where can boards really add some more value. We'll touch on some of that and get into your questions and get as well, and resources and tools at the end. So that's a lot to cover in the next 56 minutes or so. So we'll see how fast I speak and rush through it. I want to start with this quote, and this is my current favorite governance quote. Not that I have a lot of favorite governance quotes, because who would, but I do. I like this one a lot. And I think this says probably everything you need to know about the complexity and the power and the wonder of being on a board. And boards are a unique and curious leadership structure. All right there, that tells you that boards aren't quite like anything else. That the way we work on a board, that you're with people you don't necessarily know. You might have a common passion for a cause or for what an organization does. But that structure of how you work with people who aren't quite a team, aren't quite a staff group, aren't quite a family, aren't quite a whatever, they are a unique and curious structure. They have significant power. You have a ton of power being on a board. For a nonprofit, the board is the legal entity that decides what you do and how you do it and where you go. So the responsibility and power you have is really the fundamental part of being on a board, but you can only act as a collective. So no one person on that board has more power than the other. Usually you might have some situations where you've got maybe some bylaws or policy that do vest some power in people, but the power of being a board is that collectivity, and it's not about an individual. And as we see, we'll get into some of the tensions later on, sometimes that function of a board struggles a bit when individuals try to control the board to work the way they want to work. Boards sit both atop and outside the organizational structure. So I think this is one of the beauty of being a board. You do have the power, you're atop the organization. You can largely do whatever you want within the parameters established by your organization and the government. But you're also outside the organization quite often. You're not running things necessarily. I know there's a difference perhaps sometimes organizations have a board that have a paid executive or staff that manages. We'll get into some of that differentiation here in a minute. With boards actually govern and still do some of the operational work of the organization. Needless to say, though, that even if you're a board that has a sort of hands-on approach to doing some of the work, the governance function does sit separate from that. So you may be very involved in day-to-day, but how you actually work through those sort of tensions that way are a bit different for perhaps smaller organizations. So we'll talk through, that's kind of the sort of fundamental, the theoretical, maybe the sort of thought piece of what boards do. In a real technical sense is what boards do. The board is responsible for all aspects of the organization, including overseeing its operations, holding management accountable for delivering on the mission of the organization. Boards are required to make decisions that are in the organization's best interest. This is from the Chartered Public Accounts of Canada. If you ever want great resources on boards and board governance, accountants are a great place to go. So this is an umbrella group that supports accountants in Canada. We'll leave you with a list of resources at the end, and you'll get the PowerPoint of the recording at the end. So if you're looking for stuff that sort of feeds some of the basic concepts I'm throwing out there, some questions about risk or strategies, those types of work, this is a great resource to go to. So from this, the boards are they are the legal authority. They're the ones that when you think about who controls things, and maybe not the language we tend to use sometimes, but it is the board. They may delegate some of that away, but the buck starts and stops with the board of directors. So we're going to do a bit of poll right now. Liz is going to fire this up for us on a scale of, oops, I lost my question. There it is. Scale of 1 to 5. How would you rate your own understanding of nonprofit governance? So hopefully the poll's popping up there. I think somebody's voting. So there we go. Just to get a sense. Again, no right or wrong answer. Good for us to get a sense of, where people sort of sit in this world, what you know, what you don't, what you think you know, and maybe you don't. So, all right. Give you just a couple seconds here to click a number, and then I'll get Liz to share it.
Mm-hmm. We got 22 folks on this one. All right, let's go for that.
Excellent.
Right in the middle.
Okay. So, again, what you'd probably expect for something like this is you got kind of a range of folks here. Some brand new to nonprofit governance. Excellent. Hope there's lots here for you on this. Some, kind of that middle 2, 3, 4 kind of range. A few experts. Probably should get you to teach this and give myself a rest. Doesn't matter where you sit. Oh, did I have to? Oh, there we go. Again, hopefully there's something into this for you. And again, I've been on boards for years and years. And every time I sort of sit on a session where I'm not teaching it or running it for an individual board, you sort of learn stuff about, what our role may be. Okay. So we're going to talk a bit about roles and responsibilities, and really it's probably the heart of sort of the basics of nonprofit governance. Who does what and what should you do as being on a board? As a board as a whole. So we're going to look at this in 2 different ways. We're going to talk about boards as a collective. Boards as that group of 4, 5, 6, 20, however you might be, working together, trying to make decisions that are in the best interest of the organization. And some things that boards as a whole need to do are they need to focus on the entire organization. Sometimes we come into an organization saying, well, I'm an accountant, or I've got subject matter experts in singing or in providing services to the homeless, and I'm there for my sort of special expertise. Fantastic, bring that. That's certainly a part of what this is all about. You need to bring that expertise. You need to bring what you are passionate about. But your job as a board member is to focus on the entire organization, not just those areas that you have an interest in or you have some expertise in. And there's probably some varying standards in that. We'll unpack that a bit in individual responsibilities. That you work together as a whole. And that's that, going back to the opening quote, is that the boards have this unique structure where you work as a collective. And so a lot of the work of boards are sort of figuring out what it means to work as a whole. We spend a lot of time on what we call fiduciary duties, sort of that getting sort of the basic stewardship of the organization's assets and risk management and making sure things function really well. But what we tend to fall down on sometimes in boards is that how do you actually work as a team? How do you bring folks together so you can work as a whole and speak with one voice? And so out of that work as a whole concept, the second piece of that becomes you speak with one voice. So if you're working well as a board, the board has a voice, a singular voice. It's not that you have 5 different public expressions of what the board might think or do coming out. You have one expression of that. So inside a boardroom or inside around a boardroom table or in a Zoom call or whatever it might be these days, you can have as many sort of divisions and conflicts and battling it out as you want. When you move towards speaking as a board, saying we will do this, it is one voice. So you go through that process of gathering opinions internally or gathering thoughts, and then coming out with that refined voice. Largely the way boards work are to approve policy and monitor the impact of that policy. Even if you're a board that has that we do a lot of the operational work or doing some of the volunteer stuff, running programs, there still is an aspect that boards work through policy. They set direction through saying, we will do certain things. And that can be in areas like financial management. It could be areas of risk management. How do you supervise and manage staff? What rules you have for your programs, things like that. Those are policy pieces. So we'll talk a bit about how we do some of that and how that fits with other parts of the nonprofit world, but you work through policy. If you have a staff person, largely this is true in probably not saying large organizations, but boards tend to hire and supervise only one employee. So you'll have a board that governs the organization, a senior executive, sometimes an executive director, sometimes a CEO, those are pretty common. Sometimes in arts organizations, it might be an artistic director. Generally having one employee, and then after that, that person supervises whatever staff you have left. So it's the idea that the organization may have a whole bunch of employees, but the board has one, that one relationship between the board and that singular employee. Now, sometimes organizations are smaller, perhaps, that have administrative staff. You might have a couple that support the work of the board. But we're talking about organizations that have gone to an executive model in terms of doing their work. And with that, you try to avoid management and operational decisions. Finding that line between having boards govern and managers manage and staff do the work or volunteers do the work is, I think, on paper quite clear and quite easy to understand. In reality, it gets far muddier than that. So we'll talk about some of the differences and some of the ways for that as we go through as well. Individually, though, so as a board, that's what the board does collectively. Individually, though, so you've chosen to join a board, you're on a board, you're thinking, okay, well, what am I really here to do? I understand the cause of the organization, I understand it's something that I believe in and I want to participate in, but what am I really supposed to be doing when I'm here? And sometimes it's really well defined. Some boards have great policies and great understanding of what boards do. Sometimes we think we have that. We haven't really looked at it for a few years. We sort of have this policy manual that kind of sits there. Sometimes we onboard directors really well. So understanding what board members do individually, what their responsibilities are, is really, really important because there are some liabilities and some downsides that come with perhaps being on a board. There's some risks, not necessarily downsides. So each individual director on a board has a fiduciary duty to the organization. It has 2 main components. Fiduciary is you're taking care of the organization. You're acting in the organization's best interest. So the first is duty of care. To act with the competence and diligence that a reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge and expertise would exercise in comparable circumstances. There's a lot of sort of subjective words in that sentence. So to act with the competence and diligence that a reasonably prudent person would be, well, that's up for grabs at what a reasonably prudent person might be. With similar knowledge and experience, okay, we can probably figure that out. And what comparable situations are, that's hard to know. What it boils down to this, though, is that you need to bring your expertise and your knowledge that you have to the board. So if I'm an accountant, I'm not an accountant, but if I were an accountant, and I'm bringing my accounting knowledge to the board, I'm going to be sort of held to a different standard than somebody who's not an accountant. So if you are a carpenter and you come to a board, you're not going to be held to the same standard on accounting matters or financial matters as the accountant. So the competence and diligence of a reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge and experience shifts. It doesn't, however, mean that just because I'm not an accountant, that I don't need to understand financial systems. You can't sort of say that I don't have to understand the financial makings of an organization because we've got an accountant. That's their expertise. It's not up to me. You still have a duty to be informed and to make sure you have enough material so you can weigh in on, even if you're not an expert. Okay, so bring the pieces of you fully to the organization that are part of your expertise and your knowledge. The duty of loyalty. So this is where you're now, how do you make decisions to act in the best interest of the organization? So it's not about your expertise, it's about your commitment. It's about how you engage the organization, how much you say the decisions I make are in the organization's best interest. And this has things that are very simple as coming prepared. Am I coming to a meeting having read the material? It's not just I'm sitting on the board meeting, whipping through the reports, reading the financial statements as the meeting starts. I'm coming prepared to actually make decisions and to enter into a conversation or discussion about that. Have I declared any conflicts of interest? Are there things that have arisen in the course of our duty of being a board that, probably I might have a bit of a conflict here. We're talking about maybe doing an event and, somebody in my family owns the event space. It doesn't necessarily mean that I can't be involved in that discussion. Sometimes it's maybe as simple as declaring the conflict. Sometimes it's abstaining from discussion and decision-making on that, but making sure that both in what you do in terms of making best choices for the organization and how you avoid having even the appearance of being in conflict, don't take away from that. So lots of pieces on duty of care. There's things that, even having a board member who is a big supporter of the CEO. Absolutely, be supportive of your staff, but there needs to be a board support, not that you've got one sort of favorite board member who keeps the CEO in power. That's not duty of loyalty to the organization. That's sort of duty of loyalty to a CEO, which is not quite the same thing. So two big things: duty of care, duty of loyalty, bringing the best self, bringing your expertise, and doing things that are in the organization's best interest. In theory, really good. Sometimes, I think in most cases, I think most times these aren't that hard to put into reality. There's always situations that arise to think, okay, duty of loyalty, what is in the organization's best interest? And that's where it goes back to the board having to make decisions, not an individual. So within fiduciary duty, there's some lanes you work within to say, I'm here for the best interest of the organization. Fantastic, that's good to know. But how do I know kind of those broad lanes? Like, how do I know what I can and cannot do? And part of our work at Integral Org, we do work in three really big areas. One is boards. We work education like this, but we also do a lot of work one-on-one with boards, helping them do what they do better. We have a legal department to our organization. We're an approved legal services providers. We act like a law firm. And we also do strategy and planning. But when you look at the legal side of things, there are some broad laneways that have been established. When I'm talking today, I'm largely talking about Alberta nonprofits. I know we have folks from all over the world. I guess we're coming out global entity. Fantastic. I'm talking largely Alberta nonprofits and Alberta legislation. Some of the resources are really applicable in Canada, but beyond that, you probably need to do some of your own work and say, okay, how does this really work? So in Alberta, it works this way. You have an act. We have legislative acts that say this allows you to be a nonprofit. Right now, two big ones in Alberta, the Societies Act, that's about 3/4 perhaps of all the nonprofits incorporated in Alberta are under the Societies Act. Right now there's probably somewhere around 30,000 nonprofits in this province. There's a lot of them. We have a ton of nonprofits for some reason, but 3/4 of those are societies. Pretty standard, pretty basic form of incorporation. We also have nonprofit companies. You can be a part of the Companies Act. Integral Org is a nonprofit company because we have a commercial aspect to what we do in our work. So if you're carrying on a commercial activity, the Companies Act is a much better option for that kind of things. But those legislations sort of set the parameters of what you can do. What are the requirements of the Act? You don't necessarily need to go read the Act. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless you really want to. But that sets some of the parameters, and some of the materials out there, certainly in the Alberta government website, their draft bylaws perhaps will incorporate the Act and get it down to that next level are the objects, why you were formed. This tells you what you're to do. The Act sets the big rules and then say, okay, you can do certain things. To be a nonprofit, you have certain objects or articles perhaps that say, this is what we're about. These are the things, the changes we want to make in the world. If you become a charity, that becomes far more rigid. So being a charity, being a corporation or nonprofit is in a corporation status, like being a business. Getting charitable registration, being a charity, is a tax status granted by CRA. And once you have that, under some of the purposes that the CRA says are beneficial to society, you can only do things that are within your charitable purposes. So if you are a food bank, perhaps, and that's part of your charitable mandate, and you decide, yeah, we want to go and run a IT business as a little side social enterprise, probably not a part of your charitable purposes. So the things you can do go from the act to your objects, what you're incorporated to do, down to the next level is your bylaws. And this is how you'll be governed. So every nonprofit will have bylaws. They do need to be updated and reviewed every now and then just to make sure that they're up to date. And as the acts change, and the Companies Act did just change. So if you have that kind of bylaw, you probably need to update those. But this sort of tells you how you be governed, who can be a member, how members are appointed, or how they're, how you get rid of members, where you, how you hold meetings. Some of those things that are kind of standard nonprofit, they seem to be in the background, that comes from your bylaws. And policies are what you'll do. This is where I think governance policies are the big thing. You tend to have two sets of policies in a nonprofit. Governance policies telling us how the board will governance work, how we'll understand what the board's going to do, and they'll have operational policies that understand how the operations side. So Integral.org, our board has a pretty extensive governance manual that lays out the roles of board members, the different officers perhaps are in there. And then we have, things that I have as an operational CEO saying, here's what myself and the staff and my consulting group will do in terms of how we will operate. And then procedures, how we're going to carry those out, how we're going to do these things. So it's a bit of a funnel saying there are some laneways there. It's going to sort of narrow you down. So you can't just do whatever you want. Some of these things can be changed. You can change policies fairly easily. Objects and bylaws less easily, but you can change them. The legislation probably is what it is. You're not going to do much about that, which is probably good. Yeah. So to be an effective board, some of the things you probably need to think about: understanding good governance, doing the stuff you're doing now, doing this kind of work, understanding, what makes a board work, and attending to your own work as a board. It's not something that probably hits the top of our radar quite often on boards. To sort of say, well, how are we together? What are we doing? Are we doing the right things as a board? We do tend to focus on, the things on strategy and programs and financial statements. And should we do this fundraiser? What color should the napkins be of something? Sometimes we get into probably too small of discussions. But we also need to focus on our own health. And that means making sure that we're sustainable over the long term, including our work on the board. Are we recruiting? Are we developing? Are we educating our board? Other sustainability questions in the organization, not just what's happening in the next 2 or 3 months, but what's happening 5 or 4 or 3 years out. How are we sort of planning for the longer term? Ensuring that an organization has strategic directions that will guide, that will further your mission. This is an area of work that we do a lot of work in these days. I think coming out of COVID, the need for strategies and strategic planning, which can be a big process or a smaller one. Doesn't matter how big you are, how small you are, something that guides your actions, that says, okay, we have this grand vision, this grand mission, we're heading a certain direction. But what are the choices we need to make? And it's not just sort of saying what we say yes to in terms of the strategy, it's what will we say no to? What things should we not do, which is probably the harder part of strategic planning. If you do have a senior executive, you hire, guide, and evaluate the senior executive. That is a function of the board. If there are contact with other staff, that happens within some sort of structure, some sort of policy perhaps. Doesn't mean that boards never talk to anybody else on staff, or board and staff will mix from time to time here. But there's a reporting relationship and a respect that's built between the board and the senior executive, and then the senior executive and the staff. Again, ensuring your policies are kept up to date, effective, that they're redone. Probably millions of policy manuals out there that sort of been there, not really looked at, not really used. The question is, why have them then? So if you're not using them, and those are the standards that people are sort of holding you to, I think probably you need to update those from time to time. Doesn't have to be an onerous process, but if you let it go too long, it can be a little overwhelming perhaps. Again, attending to your own continuity, recruiting and developing board members, ongoing process. You might have intakes at different times, but that idea of developing your board members, both in terms of governance, like subject matter expertise. We'll talk a bit about that unique role that boards have sitting atop and outside the organization. And it's one of the tensions we'll get into about how boards can actually do their work but they're not really a part of the work. They don't necessarily know enough about the organization to make decisions, or they know too much about the organization and it's hard to make decisions as well. So that's one of the tensions we'll explore here. And that boards are ambassadors for the organization. And this is a really, really important part. That one of the primary, aspects of being a board is that advocacy, that ambassadorial role. That I don't think that's a word, but anyway, that idea of being out there and saying you're speaking for the organization. And boards can do this in ways that staff perhaps can't. When you're speaking to donors, sometimes you're speaking to governance folks. When you're speaking to, probably external stakeholders. I think staff largely have subject matter expertise and understand a lot of the organization. Board members are there because they have a passion for the organization or belief in the organization. I think that brings a credibility and a perspective that you don't necessarily get from being a staff person. So being that voice for the organization, being that ambassador for the organization is really important. It needs to be sort of, I think, not necessarily controlled, but it needs to be defined and it needs to fit within a structure. So you don't just have board members out, speaking whatever they want to speak. There's some key messaging and you know what you're speaking, and it is aligned, it is strategic. So it's both that passion, here's who I am, and I'm actually delivering the message that the board wants to speak about, because you do speak with one voice. So those are some of the key functions that you see effective boards really working through. Some of the roles and players, this has sort of come up from time to time here, just the idea that governors, so these are the board of directors, you are here to govern. And governors, their main part of work is to set tone for future direction through strategy and policy development. You're about the overall organization, setting some of those longer term goals, you're here to govern. Management is a different function. So you can picture this in two ways. One is it's a person, sometimes it's a senior executive, sometimes it's a different role for some parts of the board. So if you have a board that doesn't necessarily have a lot of staff, you may have some people who have some tasks within that board to manage, but it's a functional area is management, which is to take that policy and those strategies developed by the board and to figure out how to implement those and supervise people doing those things. It's the day-to-day activities, planning and coordinating day-to-day activities, allocating resources, perhaps managing staff, volunteers if you have that. So even if you have a senior executive, very much in that person's role, if it is a board that does this themselves, it's different function for the board. It needs to be really clearly defined so that when you are governing, it's really clear that the board's working as a governance board. Perhaps there's a management committee that's doing some of those more operational type things. Then implementation, how do you get things done? How do you deliver programs or put on concerts or feed, serve soup or put it on, whatever it might be. There's a zillion things that nonprofits do. That day-to-day operations, getting the work done, largely through staff and volunteers, perhaps some other mediums as well. So three distinct roles and sort of functional areas that you need to think about as you sort of structure the work of your nonprofit. Board and staff relationships. So again, if you are an organization that has a senior executive, just some of the things that you need to think about in terms of what that relationship looks like. And this is, I think, a really challenging area to sort of, not to get right, but to find that balance. And there's a sort of an adage in the nonprofit sector that either boards run roughshod over CEOs or CEOs run roughshod over boards. And finding that healthy balance between a board that can govern well and a CEO can manage well, and knowing that this is very much a shared leadership model, that is not one has more insight. The power all resides with the board. They may delegate some of that power. So my board has delegated certain responsibility to me, and it's very, very detailed as to saying, Mike shall do this and Mike shall not do this. So they may take some of that power and give it to me, but it's certainly ultimately rests with them. But the more tricky part is that relationship. How do you develop a really good relationship with your board chair? I have co-chairs in my board, how to develop that relationship and make sure that's a healthy and effective and one that really is quite mutually beneficial. So the roles of the senior executive, they are to execute strategies and manage the operations of the organization. You're the ones to get the stuff done. Building and sustaining relations with external stakeholders, largely on the staff side, maybe a bit on the board side, but you tend to see a lot of that moving to the staff side now. One of the things that's happened in the nonprofit world, probably in the last more than 30 years, is a professionalization of the nonprofit sector. With people who, in terms of both not just the subject matter expertise in terms of doing programs, but also on the management side, fund development perhaps, is that there is a professionalization of the workforce in nonprofit. So you do have I think a high skilled workforce managing nonprofits. It probably wasn't the case 30 or 40 years ago. The CEO reports back to all on matters, financial, operational, strategic matters to the board. So it's that, again, that building a relationship, giving information, hopefully in a dialogue sense, that you're not just sort of saying, here's what's happening. You probably want some insights from the board too to help refine and make sure you're on the same page that way. Preparing budget and operational plans, kind of standard. Sometimes that's a joint activity. Some boards will keep some of the budgeting perhaps at the treasurer level. Sometimes that's delegated down to the operational level. CEOs to support development of the board. So part of my role would be to support the board in their journey of learning about the nonprofit sector in our case, but in other cases, more subject matter areas, their own internal development, their own teamwork. It's not my job to do it for them, but it's my job to support them in their learning journeys so that they can be effective governors. And requesting consultation and support from board members in their individual areas of expertise. I think it's one of the great powers of the board is that you have a highly skilled group of individuals who are going to come from any kind of background. And there's times when things pop up and you say, I need to go talk to a lawyer. I need to go talk to my board member's an accountant or a nurse or something like that and say, I need some insight. It's not my area of expertise. You know, what do I do in this case? But it's driven by the management side. It's not where I'm sitting there as an accountant saying, okay, I've noticed some things, I'm going to come and fix them for you, Mike. It's driven from the staff side up. So that consultative expert role that you bring as an individual board member is not there to say, I'm here to run things for you. It's down there to support you in your work as you manage the organization. So the difference we see between board and staff, and there's a number of these. You know, the board acts only as a group. So again, you speak as a whole, you act as a group. Staff act individually. So I have a board to report to, there's 8 of them, there's 1 of me, I'm an individual. The board is a continuous entity. The board will go as long as the organization is in existence. So, you know, if we don't talk about the last board or another board, the board is the board. It may have individuals rotate in and out of it, but the board is continuous and it is an entity that exists as long as the nonprofit is in existence. Staff are temporary. You know, we're here at the will of the board. We know that going in. You know that, you know, we could be let go tomorrow. Really hoping that's not the case, but who knows? And boards, nonprofits run without any staff. You can't run without a board. You can run without staff, and many do. Boards are elected or appointed quite often. Staff are employed or contracted. We're here because this is a job for us. Boards are there voluntarily. Staff are paid to be there. Boards should be more oriented towards the future. That's harder sometimes, and especially in the last couple of years. I think we've been sort of head down looking at what we do to get through the next day. Staff probably should be more focused on that day-to-day operations. Again, that's a bit of attention. We'll talk about some different ways of dealing with those kind of different lenses or horizons, perhaps, that each group needs to focus upon. The board assigns authority. All authority lies with the board. They can do what they want with it within reason, within the legislative work framework. Staff receive the authority. The board gives me a delegation. I receive that. I carry it out. The board sets policy. I operate within that policy. And staff are usually lay people. And this is not always the case. You may have staff board members who have a lot of experience in your area, but you tend to hire professional staff for the nonprofit side. So again, depending on the makeup of your organization, that is a bit of difference. And I think it's not that one is necessarily better than the other. I think you bring different perspectives through that. I think having the power of board comes from that plurality of makeup, that different perspectives that sometimes you'll lose in people who have a professional insight into how a part of an organization or all organizations should work. So some of the differences you see perhaps between boards and staff. 3 of the what I would call tensions between governance, and tensions aren't necessarily a bad thing. Tensions tend to I think they can be a very creative place for us. Depending on how you deal with them. So a couple, the tension of leadership and the question of who leads an organization. Is it the CEO, the executive director? Is it the board? And there is, depending on the makeup of your organization, the timing, the where you're at in terms of your life cycle, the situation you're facing. I think this is one that probably is hard to get right sometimes. When it works really well. The idea of who is there to lead the organization. Senior executives tend to have subject matter expertise. They're immersed in things day to day. They are working on either strategy or programmatic stuff or external relations or funding. So they know a lot about the organization. They know how things work. The board is the overall authority for the organization. They hold the overall responsibility. Leadership is theirs in the organization. They may chose to give some of that. But how do you manage that tension? Who leads? Who has enough information to lead? Who has the authority to lead? So how do you manage that tension and making sure that that you're all on the same page with that. And making sure that's where a lot of the sort of challenges arrive when you're not clear about who is to do what and what level of authority or decision making different parts of the organization may have. The tension of perspective, I think I've touched on this probably a few times now, is that staff tend to be immersed. Staff, volunteers, people running programs tend to be really immersed in the organization. They know a lot about either the whole organization, or at least a very good chunk of the organization. So they know what's happening. They know what's happening with programs and funding and government relations or other organizations. Staff our boards are far more reserved. I mean, they're outside the organization. They meet, maybe once a month, maybe once every couple of months. You receive information that's not necessarily the entire organization. I write a CEO report, but it can only tell you so much every month. And so how do you have that perspective? So you're bringing different perspectives to the equation. One very immersed in the organization, one sitting atop and outside the organization from an opening quote. And so those two perspectives, I think, are sometimes a tension because you don't have the same level of knowledge, but you have different insights. And that is the beauty of the thing. You can use both perspectives, I think, to your advantage. And the last tension is time. Is just that boards are a tough one to spend time on sometimes. It's the idea that going to another board meeting, preparing for a board meeting, fully doing all these things that are part of a board can be challenging for some boards. And it's, you find that sort of collectively when it works really well for boards, it's great, but there's always one or two people who aren't there sometimes, they drop off, they're not there. How do you manage that time frame, that time commitment? But also time in a second way too, is there's also that where we focus, what the horizon of time, where we focus our energies, where boards should be focusing in terms of the next, not just the day-to-day, or very rarely the day-to-day. They want to make sure the day-to-day is sort of overseen really well. But what are they thinking 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 years down the road? Where staff and executives are sort of focusing on today and tomorrow, and how do we sort of keep the ship afloat for the near term? So we have different tensions that way. We should be focusing on different things, and they're all needed. We need to focus on all these things at once. But what's more important and where do we put our energies? I think sometimes you sort of may see senior executives wanting to think longer term and boards wanting to think very shorter term what the day-to-day are. And sometimes that is an area that you're probably messing or moving too much into each other's area of responsibility. So the combinations we're seeing, just what we see, we get calls every day or most days from a board of directors looking for some insight into either a very specific question or, can you come and talk to our board and do a little session like this for our board and talk through, hey, where are we doing well and where we're maybe not? So we're seeing a lot of issues. I think they've changed a bit from COVID. Before, I think there's a lack of clarity regarding roles and responsibilities and activities of individual board members. That's probably an ongoing area of issue. Again, no matter who you are, whether you're a large, giant organization that's got a $100 million budget run by really seemingly professional and competent board members, or you're a grassroots organization that's just doing what you're doing in your community. I think that clarity of role and that idea of understanding what the roles and responsibilities of a board are and doing this kind of stuff is really, really important. So that attending to that on a regular basis is really, really a very fundamental part of being on a board. I think that challenge is how we engage and utilize the skills and expertise of board members is always a challenge. So I've come to this board, but I'm not sure I'm giving my best. I'm not sure people are asking me to do what I can bring more, but I'm not sure how to do that. So maybe we're not structured the right way. Maybe the relationships aren't there. Maybe that relationship with the CEO is not right. But how do I bring my best self? How do I actually bring what I want to do to this organization that I have a passion for and I want to, help succeed? So how do we build systems and processes and structures that can get the best out of people? I think COVID, we're seeing a lot of this from the sort of poor or fractured relationships between either individual board members as a whole or the board and executive. COVID was hard on boards. And I think a lot of times, at least early in COVID, you saw a lot of stuff become very reactionary in the nonprofit world. We shifted really quick. A lot of the work became very operational. So either the volunteer or the staff management teams got a lot of stuff done. We pivoted online, you figured out what's going to happen with funding, you managed your staff working remotely perhaps. So boards kind of got maybe pushed a bit to the background because there was a need to be very reactive and to make sure we kept things going. But as you sort of went into COVID and it got longer and longer, and we were doing meeting over Zoom and you're not quite looking people face to face and all that kind of stuff, it got really hard to engage each other. And I think that the depth of work you can do on Zoom is quite limited. We've done most of our work on Zoom in the last couple of years, and I'm just so glad to be seeing people face to face right now in our strategy work and some of our education work. But it's hard. It's hard to work in that curious and unique leadership structure of people you don't necessarily know or sometimes like, and to do that in a remote way. So how do you, some of the relationship stuff we've seen come out, maybe settling a bit, but just in some places all out war in the last few months here. So some of that is just normal stuff. Some of that's tensions of COVID. Some of that's just poor structures from organizations that maybe weren't firing well prior to COVID. Recruiting and engaging board members. I think, one of the calls you get is, how do I get board members all the time? Where can I find people? There are some places out there that help with that. Volunteer Connectors, not a bad source. Other places we probably would delve in a little more deeply into your specific model in terms of what you need from a board. It's not just getting bodies, but the first piece is, okay, what do I really need? What skills do we need? Where are we going to go in the next 3 or 4 years? Who should we bring in, and be a little more strategic about that? But getting people to be on boards is more challenging. I think it's a generational piece. You're seeing less people volunteering in longer term roles like this over time. So how do you restructure or rebuild your organization when that pool of talent perhaps is a little more tougher to draw upon? And then how to get our work done. That's another area we see a lot of challenges. And the structure of the board. Do we have too many meetings? Are they long enough? Do we have to really have productive meetings? Do we have committees that work? It's a lot of work, especially on smaller boards, and sometimes too few bodies to do it. So what are the structural questions of how we get our work done? We bump up against those quite often. I'm going to more quickly than I had anticipated, give you just one different view of governance. So that was kind of governance 101. That's the fundamentals of governance. If you're on any board, those are all, I think, true. How they work out in reality probably has a little more nuance than that. But they tend to focus on really sort of the fiduciary side of things. It's sort of getting stuff done, stewarding the assets. And there's a body of work called Governance as Leadership. Here we are. That came out probably 10 years ago. And I like this piece of work because it takes us beyond the getting stuff done, being on a board and making sure that the roles are clear, the duties are clear, and all this stuff. Excellent stuff. Can't throw that out. But there's more to being a board than that. We talk about how to engage board members. Where do you get board members really thinking about, okay, how can I really add value? And Governance as Leadership, it was a book written by Tate and somebody, I'll come on the next slide probably, that really sort of put some more nuance to that and some more depth to that. So, and their premise was that governance discussions have focused on fiduciary duties, and governance boards primarily as instruments of accountability rather than agents of change and innovation. So it's taking that foundation of being a fiduciary board, making sure you're doing all the things right, to saying, okay, how to really drive this organization or the cause of organization forward, not necessarily the organization. So they added a couple more components to it. They talked about governance being 3 interconnected. And the word interconnected is really important. These do not stand alone, and one is not necessarily more important. I'd say you're probably going to still spend more time on fiduciary than anything else, but the other piece is to build upon that. So the first is fiduciary, focusing on the stewardship of the organization's assets. I think a lot of what I've talked about would fit into fiduciary duties so far. Taking care of assets, overseeing the audits, budgets, risk management, executive performance. In this mode, that governing, the lines between the board are really clearly defined. And I think we've sort of covered that well already, that the role of the board to govern, the role of managers to manage and execute, those are really clearly defined roles. We talk about fiduciary governance, that is a place where really clear lines of authority, lines of responsibility, lines of accountability are set. Fiduciary governance is necessary and essential. Again, we can't get rid of it, but it limits the board's involvement. And sometimes just going and, a 2-hour conversation over a budget line or, smaller pieces, those day-to-day pieces, probably isn't the most effective part for a board. It can be really you can fill a lot of time, and sometimes it doesn't mean there's not value in it, but it probably limits the time you have to spend on other parts of being a board. So it does keep perhaps the organization from stretching and growing. And that is a role the board can play a very big part in, and say, okay, what's coming up next? And so that's why they decided that there's a couple more pieces to the equation here. And this is the idea of strategic focus on creating partnerships with management to manage the future of the organization. So when we talk about strategy, we talk about kind of the next 1 to 3 years. Like when we write strat plans, we were kind of used to be 5 years. I think 3 years. In COVID, we were kind of doing 6-month ones because it was so reactive. Right now, we're starting to see that 3 years there's a little more certainty, I think, about what's coming up. So you can start to think a little longer down the road. So how do you start to work in that strategic frame? And this sort of deepens the level of the board that brings in some of the multiple perspectives, some of their expertise, where they sit. But you're talking about how we're going to further the purpose and the mission of the board, not about the day-to-day, we're about the purpose and mission. How will we get there? And when we talk about strategy, it really is getting from A to B, A being where we are today, B being where we want to be in a few years. So we think about how to get there. And that's part of the board's role, to think of what are the steps we need to take, not beyond these, certainly not the very minute steps, but the big, broad steps, we call them strategies, that we need to take to get us where we want to go in that period of time. So in this case, the role of the board is a bit different than the role of staff. The board's focused on the directions and the concepts. The really concepts are the big steps, not the details. That gets into operations. That's something for the executive, the staff team to sort of put in place to say, we're going to go down these 3 lanes. You tell us how we're going to get there. This does shift the lines between the board and the CEO to one of partnership. So in fiduciary, very clearly defined, very separate roles. This one says we're going to work together to do this. This is not done, I think, by one or the other. This is the partnership role, which can be a bit of a challenge sometimes to get that right. That tension that resides about power and direction, all those kind of things. The level of communication needs to go up though. So the information that the staff have, that external providers have, or external sources have, the board needs to have that. If you're going to set strategy, the board needs to know enough about the world you work in, the organization itself, all kinds of stuff, so they can actually set some of those strategies and set some direction for the board. So the board requires that deeper knowledge and understanding of issues. It's not just, okay, I'm going to start to plan right away because I got some ideas. It's that slowing it down, thinking what's out there, thinking where we need to go before you start making some of those pieces, thinking through those pieces. And the last one is called generative governance. And this is a bit, I think, more abstract. It definitely is more abstract, but it's really important piece. And this focuses on this board and staff on sense making for the future of the organization and exploring kind of new directions, or perhaps even kind of existential questions about the organization. So when we think about generative governance, we're thinking sometimes in terms of time, 10 years out, where we're going to be, or asking questions that sometimes are a bit heretical for organizations. Should we even exist or not? Is we've got a cause, we've got a purpose, we've got something we want to do in community, but is this organization the best mechanism to get there? Those are generative type questions. I mean, it doesn't mean you just shut down for no reason. It's but saying that is the best way to get to what we want to do, the change we want to make in the world, is this organization the best way to do it? Or should we merge or partner or do something different? So it's a room to explore kind of the what ifs, what might be. These aren't necessarily decision-making type activities, but they're really important. They're really important to think beyond, those really day-to-day minutia kind of stuff, those broad strategies to think, well, what's the world look like 5 to 10 years down the road? And what's our role going to be in that area? We're doing some work with a board next week, that does the natural gas producers. One of their generative questions will be, as we move towards non-renewables, what is the future of their organization? So some things like that, enter the discussion. Won't happen in the next 1 to 2 years, but 10 years out, who knows where we're going to be. So generative governance moves into that role of sense making. We're trying to sort of think, okay, making sense of the world as much as we know, which is hard to know as the farther out you get. But what are those insights we need to start thinking about now, not necessarily doing anything about now, but starting to incorporate into our thinking so that we can make better decisions. It's inclusive, it's creative, it's probably abstract. It can be frustrating because you're not necessarily being productive in this role necessarily, but it's really important. So you're trying to reframe questions and issues and think about what might be, not what is today. This is an area where that board and staff need to make the time for that. It's like a muscle. If you're working out, the more you use something, the easier it gets to do that. If you never use this muscle, it's hard to sort of lean into it when you need it. So we do some work on things like scenario planning, where we'll walk organization through some different scenarios of what might happen down the road, not to try and predict what might happen, but if something did happen, you tried some things, you thought that way, you've got some basic training in that area to sort of flex that muscle for when you do need it, it's there to be used. Generative thinking can sometimes be really hard for staff, I think sometimes. This is where I think it's really good that you have the boards involved in this area. Staff are building an organization. They're probably quite, committed to and well-versed and probably proud of the work they built and the organization they built. To start to think about, what are those existential questions? Should we be here or not? That can be really challenging for a CEO. So this is why I think it is that partnership, a respectful partnership and a structured partnership with the board and the CEO. Why this works well is that, you have 3 different, why I think the generative governance works well for a board is that you have all the power. So, you are the ones who make the decisions, and it doesn't matter what comes, you're still the ones who the buck stops with you. So if you're responsible for something, I think it behooves you to sort of say, let's think about what's going to happen down the road. You have plurality again. You have disparate, different voices. You're not all speaking the same internally. You're not speaking the same voice necessarily. Externally, you are. But you have that plurality of view and perspective and experience, which is so rich when you get that. I think that's what makes boards so really wonderful when they work, is you've got 5 or 6 or 10 people, all with some great insights. And how do you make the sense of that and say, this is collectively what we believe? And that position that you're not necessarily doing the day-to-day work, that you're sitting at top of the organization and outside the organization perhaps, but you're not immersed in the day-to-day. You have to worry about, the next thing coming up in an hour or 2 hours or a day or so. You've got that longer term view. So some great materials there. Chait, Ryan, and Taylor. It's a book. It'll be in the resource list here. One of the ones that sort of gets you thinking about other ways to handle governance in a nonprofit. So the sort of basic stuff, we'll give you resource stuff here in the end here. There's all kinds of material on that. There's other sort of thoughts or theories on governance. Governance and leadership is one. There's a great article. It's where that quote came from the beginning, from Stanford Social Innovation Review. It's an article called 4 Principles of Purpose-Driven Leadership, which talks about the idea of race, equity, and diversity in a nonprofit. About do you put the purpose before organization? How do boards have that accountability to stakeholders? So it adds some depths and some different views on it. So board governance tends to sort of have two or three components to it. One is the frameworks, the legislative, the bylaws, the regulatory, the structural pieces, really important, can't get away from that. It has that team and relationship, how we work together, and how do we sort of figure out how this collectivity of maybe people who don't know each other work as a group to make those things happen. But also has this, I think, an emerging part of governance we're starting to see now is how do you start to incorporate other ways of thinking? We just sort of started to do a little exploration ourselves down in INTEGRAL about how do you bring in Indigenous practices into governance, and how does that fit with the regulatory side and the working, the behavior of a board and how you work together? How do you bring in some of those different ways of thinking and dialogue and consensus and decision making, all that kind of stuff? That's emerging kind of stuff in governance, really, I think, quite exciting. And we'll see where that kind of work goes. So there's not one model. You move from those different pieces of structure to behavior to culture in some ways that I think really make governance, the thing that works for an organization. And it'll look different in every organization. 30,000 nonprofits out there. Your flavor of governance may look on the surface like it's the same. When you get into the nuts and bolts of how you actually work together, it can be really different for each organization. So a few places to look for resources. These are kind of our go-to places. Imagine Canada Standards. The Imagine Canada is an umbrella group for the nonprofits across the country. They have the standards program. You can go through some accreditation more or less to get the Imagine Canada Standards. You don't have to do that, though. You can go through the process without being accredited, which you pay for, to actually go through. And governance is one of those pieces. So they'll ask you a bunch of questions about your governance model, give you some resources. They have a handbook there. So a great resource, because it's kind of a how to build a governance model for a board. Really nice to have. The board development program, an Alberta-based teaching program. They do some education like this. They'll work with boards a little more collectively. We tend to work more one-on-one with boards, but a great resource. And so the materials are drawn from that. Some of those basic stuff. Really nice about that is Alberta-based. So you're getting content that fits really well with the Societies Act and Companies Act. You're not getting something that might be a little out of step with where we're thinking here in Alberta. Again, the Chartered Professional Accounts of Canada, national, but really good. So many resources on that site, about the board's role in strategy, the board's role in risk, the board's role in social enterprise. Some great materials there, really clear, really well written, and freely available. So one of our go-to sites and passing on resources. And Board Source. Board Source is American, so a bit of nothing wrong with that, but recognize that sometimes the language they use and the legislative stuff might not quite be the same. And so just think about that. But some great materials on tools for how to build an effective board. So it's not so much the theory, but there's some great tools on how we actually work on that collective kind of stuff. And that's it. I'm exhausted. Okay. I'm gonna stop sharing. Should I stop sharing?
No, I would keep it on because I have some slides at the end. We had a couple questions. One question was, can you speak to the board's ability to let staff go? Like, is this common? Does this ever not apply? Whoa, yeah.
What have you heard? Have you worried? Yeah, no, it's, is it common that the board has the ability to let staff go? Absolutely. I mean, when you talk about the board being the authority is the authority and staff are temporary. No, that means that one of the things that nonprofits tend to forget is you are an employer. And so you're held to the same standard, employment standards in any private or public body. So to say that I'm here to do good in the world, so therefore I can not follow the legislative rules about what a functioning business or functioning entity needs to be, you need to follow employment standards and best practice that way. So boards do let executives go. I've been on a board that had to, make a transition of the senior executive. It's not a very fun process. But sometimes it's really necessary that you get to a point where you're not going to advance the organization, or even worse, you're sort of doing damage to your cause or your reputation or the programmatic stuff, and you need to make it. So not necessarily done lightly, needs to be done really thoughtfully, it's going to likely cost you something to do this. And to make that transition it doesn't just happen overnight. So by the time it sort of percolates up to that and you go through the transition process and then bring in somebody new, that can be a long process. And we talk about this sort of separation between boards governing and managers managing. When you go through those transitions, the boards tend to move towards the management side, and then they sort of back away from that. So you'll probably blur some of those lines between governance and management when you go through a transition like that. But not common, but never off the table. I mean, it's there. We serve at the will of the board, and boards are there to do what's best for the organization. And we talk about that duty of loyalty. If they're doing what's best for the organization, and you got a board member or a founder or something like that, or a staff member that you have control over, sometimes you have to make that call, and that's not necessarily fun. It's never fun, but it's necessary sometimes. Yeah.
And I think along the same lines, is it just clarifying if the senior executive hires the day-to-day employees then, and how?
Picture it like an hourglass. Get the board, and they hire one executive, and it's now the rest of the staff volunteers. So it's kind of that bottleneck point is the senior executive, and they have their. So when you talk about board organization, the board having one employee, the senior executive, the organization may have 100 employees, but they, in some way, or they report up to that senior executive.
I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
Very good seminar. Thank you very much for putting it on. I really appreciate it. And my question would be, these seminars are very helpful. And would there be a possibility that board members take these, would be mandatory to take these or a seminar so they do understand? Because when they get into that position and don't understand, a lot of, they could avoid a lot of problems if they had to do a mandatory seminar to understand their role and the purpose.
Totally. I think that's a good question.
So
yeah, it's hard to do. It's hard to make things mandatory. That's the problem, right? You can do it. Internally, you can say, we will have a non-negotiable training session for board members internally for your board, which is good. Sometimes you may make it mandatory. My board and myself went through another training program last year. They did well in it. I did not do so well in that one for some reason. Not sure why. But the idea that, so you can make it somewhat mandatory, but it gets into that tricky place that boards are volunteers, right? And so how much time they have. So I understand what you're saying. Yeah, it'd be so much better if you understand what you're doing. But it's tough when you're a volunteer who are stressed and have your own stress from COVID and life and all that kind of stuff, to make it mandatory. I like what you're saying. Tough to do in reality, probably. Yeah.
Cool. I hope that it seems to clarify for some folks. We have a couple minutes, so I think if we do the closing now, we'll end right on time. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mike, for your expertise as always. And we hope that you all gathered some insight on this introduction to nonprofit governance. And if you are wondering where to go from here with governance development, Mike can advance the slides.
Kenny? Yes, you can.
Yes, you can. Here are some examples of services we have provided in board development. These range from development workshops with your board to coaching and even in-depth evaluations of governance policies. And, every organization's context is different, of course, so you may want to actually start with a short consultation. But these consultations can look like short conversations or 1-hour problem-solving sessions called clinics between one of our integral experts, usually sometimes it is Mike, and your team. And these consultations are completely free and are part of our mission to educate and support Alberta nonprofits. You can find out more by visiting our website or contacting the main number. I think there's one more click on this slide. of some examples. There we go. That's fine. And if you're not already signed up, we do have a brand new governance webinar coming up in just about a month. It's called Challenges of Governance. I thought this one is pretty excited for because it's no doubt that every board has its own issues, and we've seen a ton of those issues, but using the most common ones, we've created case studies that will be tackling head-on and hands-on with some of the framework that we've learned today. It'll be a great session for skill building and some peer learning as well. And hopefully we can help you try to anticipate any potential setbacks to a high functioning board. I would just like to thank everyone for joining us. Hope we all see you again soon.